In this section, we'll conclude the story of the Watergate scandal going from the 1972 election until Nixon's resignation in 1974. After McCord had sort of confessed to what he knew about the break-in, and with evidence growing in the criminal investigation, the Senate Democrats began early in 1973 their own investigation, the famous Senate Watergate hearings, and they were chaired by Senator Sam Ervin, who was from North Carolina and said he was a simply old country lawyer, but he knew exactly what he was doing. By the spring of '73, with the burglars promised immunity for their testimony, really the case was breaking open. Nixon blamed Creep's head and his former Attorney General John Mitchell. And of course, Mitchell in turn blamed White House counsel John Dean and Nixon's two top advisors, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, shown here on the left, and Nixon's top domestic advisor, John Ehrlichman, shown here on the right. Testifying before the Senate hearings, Nixon's counsel John Dean was the first to say under oath that Nixon knew about the break-in. Nixon still denied any connection and then argued that Dean was the mastermind. Meanwhile, to relieve pressure on himself, Nixon accepted the resignations of Haldeman and Ehrlichman, who appeared to be falling on their swords for Nixon. Because Mitchell had resigned as Attorney General, Nixon had selected a new Attorney General, Elliot Richardson. And Richardson decided to appoint a special investigator, a special prosecutor, a special counsel to investigate. And he named Archibald Cox as the special prosecutor. In June 1973, a former presidential aide, Alexander Butterfield, testified before the Senate Watergate hearings that a taping system existed in the Oval Office. And every time someone spoke, Butterfield explained, the taping automatically recorded what was said in the Oval Office. Of course, when the Senate hearings uncovered that there were tapes, the senators demanded to see them, claiming that the tapes were public property. Nixon denied them access, stating that they were covered by executive privilege. And that was a doctrine that the president should have certain privacy rights from the other branches of government in order to allow the president unfiltered advice. If everybody that talked to the president knew what they say would be made public, then they wouldn't be given unvarnished advice. Anyway, it was a necessary part of the balance of powers and a well-accepted doctrine. So Nixon fell back on executive privilege, saying to the Senate Watergate committee, you can't see the tapes. As the issue of the tapes went into the courts, a question of constitutional interpretation, Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox demanded to see the tapes. Now, Cox was under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice, and therefore wasn't in another branch of government. Nixon, it appeared, couldn't claim executive privilege. Nixon, therefore, ordered Attorney General Richardson to fire Cox. But Attorney General Richardson refused. Nixon then fired Richardson and appointed William Ruckelshaus as a new Attorney General, telling Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. But Ruckelshaus, like Richardson, also refused. He was not going to fire Cox, and accordingly, Nixon then fired Ruckelshaus. These firings in October 1973 became infamous as the Saturday Night Massacre. Eventually, Solicitor General Robert Bork fired Cox to maintain a semblance of order, but all of this cast extreme doubt on Nixon. With the public outrage growing, the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives began in July 1973 initial impeachment proceedings against Nixon. They began to investigate whether there was sufficient evidence to proceed with a possible impeachment. It got actually worse for Nixon. In the middle of this, in October of '73, in the middle of the unfolding Watergate scandal, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned from the vice presidency, facing prosecution for tax evasion. He struck a deal. And obviously, with your vice president resigning for corruption, it doesn't help your own position very much. Of course, under the 25th Amendment, Nixon then had the right to pick a vice president who would be confirmed by the Senate. And Nixon selected a Republican House Minority Leader Gerald Ford of Michigan as his new vice president. And Ford was confirmed by the Senate. Since Nixon had gotten Cox fired, he felt the pressure to appoint a new prosecutor, and so in early November 1973, Nixon appointed Leon Jaworski, a new special prosecutor. In November 1973, Nixon tried to calm tensions by releasing some of the tapes, but not all of them. Not only did this fail to satisfy investigators, but on one tape that was released, there was a over 18-minute gap that appeared to have been erased on just a crucial day. Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, stated that, she must have inadvertently erased it by hitting the foot pedal. Now, you hit the foot pedal, and apparently that would release the tape. And she said she must have hit the foot pedal while reaching for the phone. When the press asked her to demonstrate this for them, it appeared kind of far-fetched because she has to reach for the phone hard in an awkward position to keep her foot on the pedal. And you can see that in a Newsweek article on the right here. It didn't appear logical and seemed to, again, implicate Nixon. Still denying any guilt, in November 1973, with all this going on, Nixon famously told the press that people have a right to know if their president's a crook. And I am not a crook, he would say, and that's going to come back to haunt him in a famous phrase. Well, Nixon had appointed Jaworski a new special prosecutor, and of course in April 1974, Jaworski demanded the tape like his predecessor, Cox, and Nixon attempted to release edited transcripts in the media frenzy, but again, this didn't satisfy investigators. Moreover, Nixon's foul language on the transcripts kind of shocked many Americans. By May 1974, with Nixon still refusing to release the tapes, a constitutional crisis existed. The House Judiciary Committee under Chairman Peter Rodino began to have hearings on whether to impeach Nixon. Their initial investigation had proceeded on now to hearings. 2 months later, in July 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously, 8-0, in the case of the United States of America versus Richard Nixon. The tapes, it ruled, were not covered by executive privilege. Nixon, in short, had to release them. In late July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee, after having its hearings, voted formally to impeach Nixon. Now, this meant, to be clear, that a trial would take place in the Senate, and if convicted by the required supermajority in the Constitution, Nixon would be removed as president. That trial was the official impeachment, and so the House Judiciary Committee had issued indictments. It was 9 articles of 9 charges that would go to trial in Senate, the impeachment trial. After spending the night before trying to erase incriminating evidence, Nixon released the tapes, finally. Unfortunately for Nixon, one incriminating tape still remained, the so-called smoking gun tape. This tape, recorded on June 23, 1973, exactly 1 week just about after the break-in, records Nixon ordering the FBI off its investigation. This was clear obstruction of justice. While it was not evidence that Nixon had planned the break-in or even knew of it beforehand, it did prove that he was part of an illegal cover-up. After becoming convinced that he would not survive the formal impeachment proceedings, the Senate trial, Nixon announced that at noon on August 9, 1974, he would resign. You can see his one-sentence resignation letter on the right here. Nixon left Washington after submitting his resignation August 9, 1974. Ford then took the oath of office. While he was not officially impeached, and thus convicted in trial, Nixon became the only president ever to resign the presidency. The following month, in September 1974, the new President Ford granted Nixon a full pardon. He claimed the nation had suffered enough and that it was time to move on. Unfortunately for Ford, skeptics suggested that Ford had earlier accepted the vice presidency with the promise that he would pardon Nixon if Nixon ever resigned. Now, there's no evidence for such a quid pro quo, but the pardon did tie Ford to Watergate, and it did prove a politically unpopular decision that arguably contributed to Ford's defeat in the 1976 election. In any event, the Watergate scandal was hugely important in that it destroyed America's faith in their government, and it sort of it brought down an administration and made a whole generation of people who no longer believed what the president told them. This would have implications going forward for a lot of presidents. This concludes this section on the Watergate scandal.